Every Halloween, my friend Will would have a party on his property. He was just outside the city where we lived. His family had a small farm. Most of my friends lived in the suburbs, but it was not a long way to get to Will's place out in the country. There was a lot of space there, so pretty much everyone in our grade was invited. His parents were okay with the party, but we all had to stay outside. Nobody was allowed in the house. That was especially important because his parents were away at their own Halloween party. It was fine with us because there was a ton of space there and a big fire pit on the property. It was always a good time. One year, however, something terrifying happened. It started like any other party at his place. I was one of the first to show up, so I helped get the fire going. As time went on, others trickled in. It was all people from our high school, so I recognized pretty much everyone, with very few exceptions, although some people would occasionally bring friends from other schools. Of course, it was Halloween, so most people were dressed up and I might not know who was who at first glance. The sun was starting to set, but the fire had grown large, and it was easy to see everyone's costume. I went with my typical low-effort outfit. I had a Scream-style mask that I wore almost every year, although I would keep it up over my forehead for most of the night since it would get uncomfortable after a while. After around an hour, there were at least 20 or 30 people. We were all gathered in a large circle around the fire. Everyone was talking, laughing, and just having a good time. I was talking to my friend Chris when I noticed someone standing by himself across the circle. He was wearing a dark hoodie with some kind of scary-looking mask as a costume. The rest of his clothes were just normal. Another low-effort costume. I can't judge. I stared at him for several seconds, wondering who he was. I didn't think I knew him, but it was hard to tell with his face covered. I wasn't worried or anything, more curious at this point. After another few minutes, I walked over to the guy and tried to start a conversation. I just asked some basic questions, like how's it going, or something like that. When I heard his voice, I was surprised because he didn't sound like anyone who I knew from school, but I figured that he might be somebody's guest, so I didn't interrogate him or anything. It was strange though for a guest to be standing around by himself. Normally, if someone brings a guest, then they're with a group. After we talked for a few minutes, I excused myself and went to find Will. Will was hanging out in a group around the fire too. I pulled him aside and said, "Hey man, I was just talking to some guy who I don't recognize. I'm not sure who he knows here." "Okay, cool. Thanks. Where is he?" Will replied. I turned to look to where I'd seen the guy, but I couldn't find him. It seemed that he'd disappeared into the crowd or something. Will and I walked around for a while, but we couldn't find the guy. After a quick search, Will and I decided that it was probably no big deal, and we went back to the party. At around midnight, the party was winding down. We made sure to put out the fire, then people started to take off. I went home and got to bed at around 1 a.m. The next morning, my phone woke me up at 6 a.m. It was Will. He told me that his house was robbed that night. Someone broke a window and stole a bunch of valuable stuff from his parents. Will told the police that he'd seen a strange guy at the party and that he may have been responsible. I went to the police station to give them a description, but unfortunately, it was Halloween and the guy was wearing a mask, so my description was not very useful. I tried to describe his voice, but that probably wasn't much help either. They did eventually catch the burglar, because he was caught trying to sell some of Will's mom's jewelry to a local pawn shop. I never found out for sure if it was the guy from the party, but my guess is that it probably was. Back when I was 14 years old, my brother Alex had a Halloween party at our house. He was a few years older, and he was really trying to be popular at school at the time. A lot of people go through that phase, and he saw this party as an opportunity to make a name for himself among the more popular kids. I was kind of seen as his nerdy little brother, a source for embarrassment. Therefore, Alex told me that I had to stay in my bedroom for the entire night. That was fine with me because at that age, I was a really shy and reserved person. The idea of a big rowdy Halloween party did not seem like fun to me. Our parents were out of town for the weekend, so it was just Alex and I until his guests started showing up. As soon as 2 or 3 people had trickled in, I headed up to my room. I spent the next several hours playing some Xbox. I had a pretty sweet gaming setup at the time. I could spend days in there without getting bored. The noise from the party was loud, but it didn't bother me much, especially since I used over-the-ear headphones for gaming. The sound of the loud pop music and people talking formed a constant, almost ambient background noise, heavily muffled by my headphones. I could almost feel it through the floor as much as I could hear it. That continued for a few hours without much change, but suddenly I heard a loud scream, probably from a female. Then the talking stopped and the music was turned off. It was silent. I was startled by the change. The abrupt end to the party had me worried, so I timidly got up from my gaming chair and tiptoed down the hall to the stairs. I slowly stepped halfway down until I could peek below to the main floor and see what was going on. As I poked my head down, I could see that there were only a few people left at the party. Alex was one of them, and he was holding the phone up to his ear. I stood there confused for several seconds. Then I took 2 more steps down the staircase. That was when I realized what had happened. There was a guy laying on the ground in a puddle of what looked like blood. Someone had been attacked. It turned out that Alex was on the phone with the police, and a minute later, an ambulance arrived and took the guy to the hospital. The police arrived not more than a minute later. I tried to sneak back up to my room, but one of the officers saw me on the stairs and called me down. It turned out that 2 of the party guests had gotten into a fight, and one of them had stabbed the other. When that happened, the party quickly dispersed, and most of the guests got out of there. The only people that were left were Alex, me, and a few of Alex's closest friends. Obviously, there were a ton of witnesses for what happened, so the perpetrator was quickly caught. I think he got a few years in prison for it. I think he avoided some of the more serious charges because the other guy actually threw a few punches before. Luckily, the victim survived and made a good recovery. A few years ago when I was 22, I went to a Halloween party at a bar downtown with a few of my friends. I had volunteered to be the designated driver that night because I was trying to cut back on alcohol. The night was actually pretty fun, even though I was stone cold sober around a bunch of drunk people. The bar had free non-alcoholic drinks for designated drivers, so I had a few Cokes, then I moved on to coffee. By the end of the night, I had 3 or 4 cups of coffee, so I was pretty wired. We left the party at around midnight. I dropped my friends off at their places, then I drove home. I had a ground floor apartment with my own entrance at the front. There was a small patio that I had to walk through to get there. I opened the door and stepped inside, still feeling the caffeine. My hand was shaking slightly when I flicked on the light switch. I looked over at my couch and TV, thinking that it looked like a good place to sit and wait for the caffeine to wear off. Since it was Halloween, I decided to watch some of the old horror movies that I'd not seen in a long time. I started with the first Friday the 13th film, then continued to the second. Partway through the second film, I heard a loud knock on my door. I was startled and confused. It was past 2 a.m., so trick-or-treating was long over. Maybe I should have just ignored it, but I was too curious not to take a look. I muted the TV and slowly tiptoed to my front door. Once there, I pressed my eye up to the peephole on the door. Standing in front of my apartment was a man in a full clown costume. He wore an orange wig with some pretty elaborate makeup. It looked super creepy. I took a step back and started shaking. My mind raced as I considered my options. Calling the police was a good option, but I decided not to bother with them since nothing really happened yet. After some consideration, I decided to just ignore it and see what he does. He continued knocking for a few more minutes, but never said a word. I stood there behind the door hoping he would just go away, and eventually, that's exactly what he did. I could see his shadow through my curtains as he slowly walked past my window and away from my door. I guess he got bored, I laughed to myself. By then, I had pretty much given up on getting any sleep, so I went back to the movie. I eventually passed out at around the 5th installment of the Friday the 13th franchise. I woke up on my couch to a knock at the door at around 11 a.m. Half expecting to see another creepy clown, I walked over to check it out. Looking through my peephole, what I saw might have been even more surprising than the clown. It was the police. I opened the door and stood there in front of the officers, a confused look on my face. The police explained to me that there had been a robbery in my building. My neighbor a few doors down had been woken up by a knock on her door in the middle of the night, and when she answered it, she was attacked, one of the officers told me. The other officer chimed in and added that the attacker was a man in a full clown costume. It must have been the same guy, I thought. I promptly told the officers what had happened to me the night before, that I saw a guy in a clown costume and that he tried knocking on my door too. They took a statement from me, but really, I was not able to tell them anything that they weren't already aware of. As far as I know, the clown was never caught. As a side note, I wanted to know why my neighbor decided to open the door for the guy, but I don't really know her that well, and I thought it might be rude to ask. Who opens the door for a strange clown in the middle of the night? Not me.